The howling wind rattled the windows of the old farmhouse as Jake Miller stared at the foreclosure notice in his trembling hands. Outside, the worst blizzard North Dakota had seen in 20 years was building strength, but the storm raging in. His heart was far more devastating. In just 72 hours, the farm that had been in his family for 4 generations would belong to the bank, and his 10-year-old daughter Emma would lose the only home she'd ever known. He had no idea that in less than 3 hours, a chance encounter on a snow-covered highway would not only save a life, but resurrect his own future in ways he could never have imagined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jake Miller pulled his worn flannel shirt tighter around his shoulders as he watched the snow pile against the kitchen window. The coffee in his chipped mug had long gone cold, but he hadn't noticed. His eyes remained fixed on the official document, spread across the scarred oak table, its bold letters spelling out the end of everything he'd worked for. First, National Bank of Millbrook had given him until Monday morning to vacate the premises. 3 days to pack up 4 generations of memories. 3 days to explain to his daughter why they had to leave the only stability she'd known since her mother died. The numbers on his latest bank statement mocked him from beside the foreclosure. Notice $18,432. That's all that stood between him and keeping his family's legacy alive. It might as well have been 18 million. The drought last summer had decimated his wheat crop, and the corn had barely broken even after the fuel and fertilizer costs. He'd already sold every piece of equipment he could spare, keeping only the essential tractor and the old pickup truck that had more rust than paint. Emma's laughter drifted down from upstairs where she was playing with her collection of hand-carved wooden animals, each one made by her great-grandfather during the long winter months decades ago. She had no idea that by Tuesday, those precious heirlooms might be all they had left of the Miller family farm. Jake rubbed his calloused hands across his face, feeling every one of his 38 years weighing on him like centuries. The phone rang, startling him from his spiral of despair. The caller ID showed Linda Torres, their neighbor from the farm 3 miles east. Jake considered not answering, knowing she'd probably heard about the foreclosure through the rural grapevine that spread news faster than wildfire. But Linda had been nothing but kind since Amy's death 2 years ago, often dropping by with casseroles or offering to watch Emma when Jake needed to work late in the fields. "Jake, thank God you answered." Linda's voice carried an urgency that immediately set him on edge. "Have you looked outside recently? The weather service just upgraded this storm to a full blizzard warning. They're saying it could dump 2 feet by morning with winds up to 60 miles per hour. Jake glanced toward the window, noticing for the first time how the snow had intensified from lazy flakes to a near horizontal assault. "I saw it was picking up. Emma and I aren't going anywhere tonight." "That's not why I'm calling. Bill Henderson just radioed in from his shop. Says there's already a couple cars stuck out on Highway 83, and the county plows won't be able to get out there for hours. You know how that stretch gets with the drifting." Highway 83 ran along the northern edge of Jake's property, a notorious stretch where the open fields allowed snow to pile into massive drifts that could swallow a car whole. During storms like this, it became a death trap for unprepared travelers. "Not much I can do about it, Linda. The sheriff's department will have to handle any rescues." "Jake, listen to me." Linda's voice softened. "I know what you're going through with the farm and all, but sitting in that house staring at bank papers isn't going to change anything tonight. Maybe helping someone else might. I don't know, might take your mind off things for a bit." Jake almost laughed at the suggestion. Here he was, about to lose everything, and Linda thought playing Good Samaritan would somehow make it better. But as he looked around the kitchen, at the pencil marks on the doorframe marking Emma's growth, at the cast iron skillet his grandmother had used every morning for 50 years, he realized that drowning in self-pity wasn't accomplishing anything. Either. Did Bill say where exactly these cars were stuck? Mile marker 127, right where that old grain elevator used to be. He was heading home from town when he spotted them. Said it looked like a newer sedan, completely buried in a drift. No way they're getting out without help. Jake sighed, already reaching for his heavy winter coat hanging by the door. His old Ford pickup might be held together with baling wire and prayer, but it had a winch and chains in the bed, and he'd pulled more than his share of vehicles out of snowbanks over the years. "Emma!" he called up the stairs. "Get your snow boots on. We need to run an errand." His daughter appeared at the top of the stairs, her blonde pigtails bouncing as she hurried down. At 10 years old, she had her mother's bright blue eyes and optimistic spirit, somehow maintaining her cheerfulness despite the loss they'd endured. "Where are we going, Dad? It's really snowing hard outside. Someone's stuck out on the highway. Thought we might go see if we can help." Emma's face lit up with excitement. "Like a rescue mission?" "Something like that." Jake helped her into her puffy pink coat, the one Amy had bought on sale the year before she died. It was getting a bit small now, the sleeves riding up Emma's wrists, but there was no money for a new one. "We'll take some blankets and the thermos of hot chocolate from this morning, just in case they need warming up." As they prepared to leave, Jake's mind briefly returned to the foreclosure notice on the table. In 3 days, none of this would matter. The bank would take the farm. He and Emma would have to find somewhere else to live, probably in town where he could find work at the grain elevator or maybe the hardware store. But tonight, in this storm, he could still be useful. He could still make a difference, even if it was just helping a stranger get unstuck from a snowdrift. The wind hit them like a physical force when they stepped outside. Emma grabbed his hand tightly as they made their way to the truck, the snow already accumulating in deep drifts across the driveway. Jake had to use the shovel to clear around the driver's door before they could climb in. The old Ford protested as he turned the key, the engine groaning in the cold before finally catching. The heater blew cold air for the first few minutes as they navigated the long driveway to the main road. Visibility was down to maybe 20 feet, the headlights illuminating a swirling wall of white. "Dad, this is kind of scary," Emma said quietly, her earlier excitement tempered by the reality of the storm. "We'll be careful, sweetheart. The truck's heavy, and I've driven in worse than this." That was mostly true, though Jake couldn't remember many storms that had come on this fast or this fierce. The 2-mile drive to mile marker 127 took nearly 20 minutes, the truck crawling along at 15 miles per hour. Jake kept the passenger side wheels on the rumble strip, using the vibration to know he was still on the pavement. The wind buffeted the truck, threatening to push them into the ditch with each gust. Finally, through the white chaos, Jake spotted a dark shape ahead. As they drew closer, his headlights revealed a silver Lexus sedan, its front end buried in a snowdrift that had already climbed halfway up the doors. The car's emergency flashers blinked weakly, barely visible through the accumulating snow. Jake pulled up behind the stranded vehicle, positioning his truck to provide some shelter from the wind. "Stay here," he told Emma, leaving the engine running and the heater on full blast. He grabbed a flashlight and pushed out into the storm. The wind nearly knocked him over as he approached the Lexus. He could see a figure inside, hunched over the steering wheel. Jake knocked on the driver's window, having to hit it several times before the person inside startled and looked up. The window lowered a few inches, and Jake found himself looking at a woman in her early 60s, her silver hair styled in a professional cut, wearing what appeared to be an expensive business suit underneath a wool coat. Her face was pale with cold and fear. "Thank goodness someone came," she said, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. "I've been stuck here for over an hour. My phone has no signal and the snow just keeps getting deeper. Ma'am, I'm Jake Miller. I live just up the road. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Let's get you out of there and into my truck where it's warm. We can worry about your car later. The woman nodded gratefully. Jake had to pull hard to get her door open against the packed snow. As she climbed out, he noticed her expensive leather shoes were completely inappropriate for the weather, already soaked through with snow. "Can you grab any essentials from your car?" Jake asked, supporting her arm as she struggled through the knee-deep drift. "We might not be able to come back for it until after the storm." The woman reached back into the car, pulling out a leather briefcase and a small overnight bag. "This is all I really need. Everything else can wait." Jake helped her to his truck, practically carrying her the last few steps as her legs gave out from cold and exhaustion. Emma scooted over to make room as they climbed in, immediately offering the thermos of hot chocolate. "Here, this will warm you up," Emma said with her characteristic kindness. The woman accepted gratefully, her hands shaking as she held the cup. "Thank you, sweetheart. And thank you," she looked at Jake. "Mr. Miller, was it? I honestly thought I might freeze to death out there. Please call me Jake. And this is my daughter, Emma." He put the truck in gear, carefully maneuvering around the stranded Lexus. "I'm afraid your car's not going anywhere tonight. This storm's supposed to get worse before morning. Where were you headed?" "Bismarck. I had a meeting with the Agricultural Committee tomorrow morning, but clearly that's not happening now." The woman took another sip of hot chocolate, color slowly returning to her cheeks. "I'm Patricia Richardson, by the way. Pat." The name tickled something in Jake's memory, but he was too focused on navigating through the storm to give it much thought. "Well, Pat, the nearest town is Millbrook, about 5 miles ahead, but I don't think we're going to make it that far in this weather. Roads are getting worse by the minute." As if to emphasize his point, the truck suddenly lurched sideways, sliding toward the ditch before Jake managed to correct it. Emma grabbed his arm, and he heard Pat's sharp intake of breath. "My farm's just up ahead," Jake said, making a quick decision. "You can wait out the storm there. It's not fancy, but it's warm and safe." "That's incredibly kind of you. I promise I won't be any trouble." The remaining mile to the farm driveway took another 15 minutes of white-knuckle driving. Jake had never been so relieved to see the faded mailbox marking his property. The driveway was already almost impassable, snow drifting across it in waves. He gunned the engine, using momentum to push through the deeper sections until they finally reached the shelter of the old barn. "We made it," Emma cheered, and even Jake allowed himself a small smile of relief. They rushed from the truck to the house, the wind pushing them along like leaves. Once inside, Jake quickly built up the fire in the wood stove, while Emma showed Pat to the bathroom and found some dry clothes that had belonged to Amy. Soon they were all gathered in the living room, Pat now wearing Amy's old sweatpants and a University of North Dakota hoodie, looking far more comfortable than she had in her business attire. She accepted a bowl of the beef stew Jake had made that afternoon, eating with obvious hunger. "I can't thank you enough," Pat said between bites. "I thought I knew how to handle winter driving, but this storm came out of nowhere." "These plains. Storms can be treacherous," Jake agreed. "Weather Service is calling this one of the worst in 20 years. He glanced at Emma, who was showing Pat her collection of carved animals. "We don't get many visitors out here, especially in weather like this." Pat smiled at Emma's enthusiasm. "These are beautiful. Did someone in your family make them?" "My great-great-grandpa," Emma said proudly. "He made them during the winters when he couldn't work in the fields. Dad says they're heirlooms." Jake noticed Pat's eyes scanning the room, taking in the family photos on the mantel, the worn but clean furniture, the obvious care with which the old house was maintained despite its age. Her gaze lingered on a photo of Amy, Jake, and Emma taken at the county fair 3 years ago. "Your wife?" Pat asked gently. "She passed 2 years ago. Cancer." Jake's voice was steady, but the familiar ache squeezed his chest. "I'm so sorry. Emma and I manage okay." He glanced at his daughter, who had moved on to explaining the intricacies of her favorite board game. "She's been incredibly strong through it all." Pat nodded thoughtfully. "Children often are. They have a resilience we adults sometimes lose along the way." As the evening wore on, the storm continued to rage outside. Jake made up the guest room, grateful that he'd kept it clean despite rarely having visitors. Pat helped Emma with her math homework, while Jake tended to the fire and worried about the animals in the barn. They'd be okay for the night, but if this storm lasted multiple days, feeding them would become a challenge. Around 8 o'clock, Jake sent Emma to bed, tucking her in with extra blankets against the cold that seeped through the old windows, despite the storm shutters. "Is that lady going to stay with us?" Emma asked as he kissed her forehead. "Just until the storm passes and we can get her car unstuck. I like her. She's nice." Emma yawned. "Dad, are we going to be okay? I heard you on the phone with the bank last week." Jake's heart clenched. He tried so hard to shield her from their financial troubles. "Don't you worry about that, sweetheart. Everything's going to work out fine." But as he closed her door and returned downstairs, the weight of their situation settled back on his shoulders. Pat was sitting by the fire, the leather briefcase he'd rescued from her car open on the coffee table, papers spread across it. "I hope you don't mind," she said as he entered. "I thought I'd get some work done since we're stuck here anyway." "Of course not. Can I get you anything? More coffee?" "Coffee would be wonderful, thank you." Jake prepared a fresh pot, his mind drifting to the irony of the situation. Here he was, playing host to a stranger while his world crumbled around him. In 3 days, this house wouldn't even be his to offer shelter in. When he returned with the coffee, Pat had put aside her papers and was looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Jake, can I ask you something personal?" He set down the mugs, wary. "I suppose. How long has the farm been in your family?" The question caught him off guard. 4 generations. My great-grandfather homesteaded this land in 1889. Why do you ask?" Pat picked up her coffee mug, seeming to choose her words carefully. "I noticed some paperwork on your kitchen table when we came in. I wasn't trying to snoop, but are you facing foreclosure?" Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks. The shame of his failure washed over him. Anew, the drought last year hit us hard. Couldn't make the mortgage payments, banks calling in the loan. "First National Bank of Millbrook?" He nodded, surprised she knew the local bank. "And they're not willing to work with you? No restructuring options?" Jake laughed bitterly. "They were bought out by a larger chain 6 months ago. New management doesn't care about family farms or community relationships. They just want their money." Pat was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When she spoke again, her voice carried an edge he hadn't heard before. "I see this happening too often. Small family operations being forced out by circumstances beyond their control, while large corporations buy up the land for industrial farming. It's just business, I guess," Jake said, though the words tasted bitter. "No," Pat said firmly. "It's not just business, it's the systematic destruction of rural communities and family agriculture, and it needs to stop." There was something in her tone that made Jake look at her more closely. The way she spoke with authority and passion suggested she was more than just a traveling businesswoman. "What kind of work do you do, Pat?" She smiled slightly. "I work for the state government, agricultural policy mainly. That's why I was heading to Bismarck for that committee meeting." Before Jake could respond, the lights flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness save for the fire's glow. The power lines had finally succumbed to the storm. "Well," Jake said, reaching for the oil lamps he kept for such occasions. "Looks like we're going pioneer style for the rest of the night." As he lit the lamps, casting a warm golden glow through the room, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Pat than she was revealing. But whatever her story, she was a guest in his home, and he would treat her with the same hospitality his family had always shown to travelers in need. The wind howled louder, rattling the windows in their frames. Somewhere out in that white chaos, Pat's expensive car was being buried deeper by the hour. Tomorrow would bring the challenge of digging out, of facing reality again. But tonight, in the circle of lamplight with the storm raging outside, Jake allowed himself to forget about foreclosures and failures. Tonight, he had done something good, something that mattered. He had saved someone's life. What he didn't know yet was that the person he'd saved might just have the power to save him in return. The old generator in the barn kicked to life with a reluctant rumble, bringing essential power back to the house. Jake had waded through waist-deep snow to reach it, the wind nearly knocking him down several times during the 100-yard journey. His fingers were numb, despite his work gloves, and ice crystals clung to his beard as he stumbled back inside. Pat looked up from where she sat near the wood stove, still wrapped in Amy's old quilt. "You must be frozen. Here, I made more coffee." Jake gratefully accepted the steaming mug, his hands slowly regaining feeling as he held it. Through the kitchen window, he could barely make out the barn's outline through the blowing snow. The storm showed no signs of weakening. "The generator should keep the essentials running," he explained, settling into his worn armchair. "Refrigerator? We'll pump a few lights. We'll need to be conservative, though. Only got enough fuel for maybe 3 days." Pat nodded, then gestured to her briefcase. "While you were outside, I made some calls on my satellite phone. The storm's even worse than they predicted. Highway Patrol has closed all the main roads. We're looking at least 48 hours before anything's passable." "You have a satellite phone?" Jake couldn't hide his surprise. Most people relied on cell towers, which were notoriously unreliable during storms. "Part of my work equipment. In my position, I need to stay connected even in remote areas." She paused, studying him. "Jake, I need to be honest with you about something." Before she could continue, Emma appeared at the bottom of the stairs, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Dad, the wind woke me up. It sounds angry." Jake opened his arms and she crawled into his lap, something she hadn't done much lately as she grew older. "Just a storm, sweetheart. We're safe inside." "Is Ms. Pat still here?" "The roads are closed, so she'll be staying with us for a couple days," Jake explained. "Is that okay with you?" Emma nodded, then looked at Pat. "Do you have any kids?" Pat's expression softened. "I have 2 daughters, but they're grown up now. One lives in Seattle, the other in Denver. I have 3 grandchildren about your age. Do you miss them?" "Every day." Pat pulled out her phone, showing Emma photos. "This is Sophia, she's 11. And these are the twins, Michael and James. They're 8. As the two chatted about Pat's grandchildren, Jake found himself studying their guest more carefully. Everything about her suggested wealth and influence, from her manicured hands to the way she carried herself. Yet here she sat, in his humble living room, wearing his late wife's clothes, showing genuine interest in his daughter's chatter. "Dad, can I show Miss Pat my room? I want her to see my butterfly collection." "It's pretty late, maybe tomorrow." "Actually," Pat interjected, "I'd love to see it if you don't mind. I collected butterflies when I was young too." Emma's face lit up, and she grabbed Pat's hand, leading her upstairs. Jake followed, noting how Pat didn't hesitate, despite the steep creaking stairs and narrow hallway. Emma's room was small but cheerful, the walls painted a soft yellow that Amy had chosen. The butterfly collection, carefully mounted in shadow boxes, covered one entire wall. "Oh my," Pat breathed, examining the specimens. "These are beautifully preserved. Did you catch them all yourself? Mom and I did, Emma said quietly. She taught me how to mount them properly. We used to go to the meadow behind the barn every summer. Jake watched Pat's face as Emma explained each butterfly, noting the genuine interest and respect she showed for his daughter's knowledge. When Emma finally yawned again, Pat tucked her in with practiced ease. Sleep tight, sweetheart. We'll talk more about butterflies tomorrow. Back downstairs, Pat returned to her spot by the fire while Jake added another log to the stove. The silence stretched between them, comfortable but weighted with unspoken things. "She's remarkable, Patty," finally said. "You've done an amazing job raising her, especially given everything you've been through. She makes it easy, got her mother's spirit." Jake stared into the flames. "I just wish I could give her more stability, losing the farm." "About that," Pat interrupted, "I need to tell you something. I wasn't entirely truthful earlier about my work." Jake looked up, wary. "I do work for the state government, that's true. But specifically, I'm a state senator, Patricia Richardson. I chair the Agricultural Committee." The name clicked into place. Jake had seen it in newspapers on legislation affecting farmers. Senator Richardson was known as a fierce advocate for family farms, often butting heads with corporate agricultural interests. "Why didn't you say so earlier?" "Because I wanted you to treat me like a person, not a title. And you did. You risked your safety to help a stranger, opened your home without question. That means more than you know." Jake shifted uncomfortably. Anyone would have done the same. "No," Pat said firmly. "They wouldn't. I've been stuck before, had people drive right past. You chose to help even though you're facing your own crisis." She reached for her briefcase, pulling out a thick folder. "Before this storm hit, I was investigating something. Tell me, has your bank been unusually aggressive about calling in loans lately?" Jake frowned. "Yeah, actually. Several farms in the area have gone under in the past year. Good operations too. The Andersons, the Petrosky place, both foreclosed after one bad season." Pat nodded, unsurprised. First National Bank of Millbrook was acquired by Heartland Financial Corporation 6 months ago, correct? That's right. Everything changed after that. The local manager, Mike Brennan, used to work with us, give extensions when needed. Now, he acts like he's never met us. That's because he's being pressured from above. Pat opened the folder, revealing documents covered in financial data. Heartland Financial has ties to several large agricultural corporations. They've been systematically foreclosing on strategic properties, which then get sold to these corporations at below market rates. Jake leaned forward, trying to process this. "You mean it's intentional? They're deliberately forcing us out?" "I've been gathering evidence for months. Your farm, Jake, sits on one of the largest underground water reserves in the county, perfect for industrial irrigation. Midwest AgriCorp has had their eye on this area for 3 years. The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. All this time he'd blamed himself, thought he'd failed as a farmer, as a provider. To learn it might have been orchestrated. "Can you prove this?" "I'm close, but I need more concrete evidence. Specifically about the loan modification process. Tell me, did they offer you any alternatives before moving to foreclosure?" Jake shook his head. "Brennan said there were no options. Straight to foreclosure after 90 days. That's illegal." Pat's voice hardened. "Federal law requires lenders to offer loan modification options. Did you receive written notice of these rights?" No, everything was verbal. Brennan said the new management had strict policies." Pat made notes rapidly. "What about other farmers? Did any of them receive proper notices?" "I don't think so. Tom Anderson mentioned something similar before he lost his place, said they stonewalled him at every turn." As they talked, Jake pulled out his own files, showing Pat the correspondence with the bank. She photographed each document with her phone, occasionally asking for clarification. The more she saw, the more her expression darkened. "This is worse than I thought," she muttered. "They're not just bending the rules, they're completely ignoring federal banking regulations. But what can be done? The foreclosure goes through Monday morning." Pat looked at him intently. "Jake, I need you to trust me. I have contacts, people who can intervene if we can prove systematic violation of banking laws, but I need your permission to use your case as evidence." "Of course, but there's no time." "Let me worry about time." She pulled out her satellite phone again. "What's your full legal name and the loan number?" As Jake provided the information, Pat made several calls, her demeanor shifting into what he now recognized as her senator persona. She spoke with authority, dropping names and referencing statutes with ease. Despite the late hour, people answered her calls, took her seriously. "Yes, I understand it's Friday night," she said into the phone. "But I have evidence of systematic violation of the Fair Housing Act and the Dodd-Frank regulations. I need an emergency injunction filed first thing Monday morning." She listened, then continued, "I'm aware of the weather situation. I'm currently stranded at one of the affected properties. The owner saved my life tonight, pulled me out of a snowbank in the middle of a blizzard. The least I can do is ensure he gets fair treatment under the law." After several more calls, she turned back to Jake. "I've got the state attorney general's office involved. They're going to file for an emergency stay of foreclosure pending investigation. It's not a permanent solution, but it buys us time." Jake felt a spark of something he hadn't experienced in months: hope. "Why are you doing this?" Pat set down her phone, her expression thoughtful. "Because this is exactly why I went into public service. I grew up on a farm in Minnesota, watched my father lose everything in the 80s farm crisis. He never recovered, died thinking he was a failure. I swore I'd never let that happen to other families if I could help it." The wind gusted particularly hard, making the old house groan. They both looked toward the windows, where snow continued to pile against the glass. "Looks like we're in for a long siege," Jake observed. "Good," Pat said firmly. "Gives me time to work. Jake, I need you to tell me everything. Every interaction. With the bank, every document they gave you or didn't give you. We're going to build a case that exposes this whole scheme." For the next several hours, they worked side by side at the kitchen table. Jake pulled out every piece of paper related to the farm's finances, while Pat organized them into categories, making detailed notes. She had him recall conversations, dates, specific words used by bank officials. "They were counting on you not knowing your rights," she explained. "Most farmers don't have time to study banking law. They trust their local institutions." "And they betrayed that trust," Jake said bitterly. "Yes, but we're going to make them accountable. This pattern of behavior, if we can prove it's systematic, could trigger a federal investigation. Your farm might be the key to saving dozens of others." As the night wore on, Jake found himself energized despite his exhaustion. For months, he'd felt like he was fighting alone, drowning in paperwork and legal terms he didn't understand. Now, he had an ally, someone who understood both the system and the stakes. Around 3 in the morning, Pat finally closed her laptop. "I think we have enough to start. The Attorney General's office will file the emergency motion as soon as the courts open Monday." "What are the chances?" Jake asked, afraid to hope too much. "Honestly, good. The evidence of procedural violations is clear. That won't solve your underlying financial issues, but it stops the immediate foreclosure and forces the bank to negotiate in good faith." Jake slumped back in his chair, the relief making him lightheaded. "I don't know how to thank you." "You already have," Pat said simply. "You saved my life tonight. Without your help, I'd have frozen to death in that car. This is what neighbors do for each other. What communities used to be about before everything became transactional." She stood, stretching. We should both get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be busy. Once this storm breaks, I'll need to coordinate with my office. Get these documents to the right people. As they prepared to retire, Jake paused at the bottom of the stairs. Senator Richardson, Pat, can I ask you something? Of course. Earlier tonight, when you were stuck in that drift, what were you thinking about? Pat's expression grew, distant. My father, actually. How he used to say that farming wasn't just a business, it was a calling. That the land connects us to something bigger than ourselves. I was thinking how disappointed he'd be in what we've let happen to rural America. I don't think he'd be disappointed in you, Jake said quietly. Pat smiled, the professional mask, slipping to reveal genuine warmth. Get some rest, Jake. We've got a farm to save. As Jake lay in bed, listening to the storm rage outside, he thought about the strange turns life could take. This morning, he'd been preparing to lose everything. Tonight, a chance encounter in a blizzard had brought unexpected hope. He didn't know if Pat's efforts would ultimately save the farm, but for the first time in months, he didn't feel alone in the fight. The wind continued to howl, piling snow ever deeper around the old farmhouse. But inside, protected by walls, built by his great-grandfather's hands, Jake Miller finally allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, those walls would continue to shelter his family for generations to come. In the guest room, Pat Richardson sat by the window, watching the snow swirl in the lamplight. Her satellite phone showed several missed calls from her staff, probably wondering why she hadn't made it to Bismarck. Tomorrow she'd explain. Would set in motion the legal machinery needed to fight Heartland Financial's predatory practices. But tonight, she thought about Jake's simple act of kindness, how he'd risked his safety for a stranger. In all her years in politics, surrounded by people who calculated every action for personal gain, she'd almost forgotten such selflessness existed. It reminded her why she'd entered public service in the first place, to protect people like Jake and Emma, families who embodied the values that built this country. The storm would pass, as all storms do, but the connections forged in its midst, between strangers who became allies, between past injustices and present opportunities for redemption, would endure far longer. Saturday morning arrived with an eerie stillness. The wind had finally died down, leaving behind a landscape transformed by snow. Jake woke before dawn, as farmers do regardless of circumstances, and peered out his bedroom window at a world made unrecognizable by white drifts that reached the first-floor windowsills. Moving quietly to avoid waking his guests, he dressed in his warmest clothes and made his way downstairs. The generator hummed steadily in the background, a reassuring sound that meant they still had power. He started coffee brewing and began planning the day's essential tasks. The cattle would need feeding, paths would need to be cleared, and they'd have to check on the older equipment in the barn. Pat appeared in the kitchen doorway just as the coffee finished brewing. She'd changed back into Amy's borrowed clothes, having laid out her business suit to dry. "Morning," she said, accepting the mug Jake offered. "The storm's passed. Looks like it going to take some serious digging to get out, though." Jake gestured toward the window where the snow had drifted halfway up the glass. "I need to check on the animals once it's light. You're welcome to stay inside where it's warm. Actually, I'd like to help if you have extra winter gear. I haven't done farm chores since I was Emma's age, but I remember the basics." Jake studied her with surprise. "You sure it's going to be cold, hard work?" "I've spent too many years in climate-controlled offices," Pat said with a self-deprecating smile. "Might do me good to remember what real work feels like." An hour later, bundled in Amy's old winter coveralls and boots, Pat followed Jake through the path he'd shoveled to the barn. The sun had risen into a crystalline blue sky, making the snow sparkle like scattered diamonds. The thermometer by the barn door read 12 below zero. Inside the barn, the cattle lowed restlessly in their stalls. Jake showed Pat how to fork hay while he handled the grain distribution. She worked steadily, without complaint, though he noticed her pausing occasionally to catch her breath. "Different from the state capitol building?" he asked with a slight smile. "Just a bit," she replied, leaning on the pitchfork, "though there's something oddly similar about shoveling hay and dealing with political bullsh." She caught herself glancing toward the house where Emma might be listening. Political nonsense. As they worked, Pat asked questions about the of arms operations. Jake found himself explaining things he'd taken for granted: crop rotation, soil management, the delicate balance required to maintain a sustainable family farm. "We're not just growing crops," he said, filling water troughs. "We're stewarding the land. My great-grandfather understood that. Each generation has tried to leave the soil better than they found it. And that's exactly what industrial agriculture doesn't understand," Pat mused. "They see land as a resource to be exploited, not a legacy to be preserved." Emma appeared in the barn doorway, wrapped in her purple snowsuit. "Dad, can we build a snow fort? The drifts are perfect." "Chores first, Em. Want to help feed the chickens?" As his daughter scattered feed for the small flock they kept for eggs, Jake watched Pat observing the interaction. There was something in her expression, a wistfulness perhaps, or maybe recognition of something lost in her own life. "Your efficiency reports probably don't mention moments like these," Jake commented. "No," Pat agreed softly. "They don't capture the generational knowledge being passed down, the connection to the land, the values being taught alongside the work. We've reduced everything to numbers on spreadsheets, forgetting what those numbers represent." After the morning chores, they returned to the house to find the power had come back on. The weather report showed the storm had dumped 28 inches of snow across the region, with drifts reaching 10 feet in some areas. Road crews were beginning to dig out, but rural routes would be last priority. Pat immediately got on her phone, checking in with her staff and coordinating the legal filings they'd discussed. Jake listened to her side of various conversations, impressed by her ability to switch between technical legal language and political persuasion as needed. "Yes, I'm fine," she said into the phone. "Stayed with a local family. No, reschedule the Bismarck meeting for Wednesday. Actually, this situation has given me some critical insights into the Heartland financial investigation. I want a full team meeting Tuesday morning." While Pat worked her political channels, Jake and Emma tackled the monumental task of digging out. They cleared paths to essential buildings first, then began the slow work of excavating vehicles. The pickup truck was buried up to its windows, while Pat's Lexus was merely a vague bump in the landscape. "It's like finding buried treasure," Emma exclaimed, brushing snow off the truck's windshield. By midday, Jake had managed to get his truck running and carved a rough path down the driveway. The main road remained impassable, but at least they had mobility around the property. Pat joined them outside, having finished her calls. "Any word on when the roads might open?" Jake asked. "Highway department says maybe tomorrow afternoon for the main routes. Rural roads could be Tuesday or later." She looked at the buried Lexus. "I don't suppose that's going anywhere soon. Not without a tow truck, but you're welcome to stay as long as needed. Actually," Jake hesitated, then continued, "it might be better if you're here Monday morning when Brennan comes calling. Having a state senator as a witness might keep things civil." Pat's expression hardened. "Oh, I'm definitely staying for that conversation. Mr. Brennan and I have several things to discuss about his bank's practices." That afternoon, while Emma napped and Jake tended to afternoon chores, Pat spread her research across the kitchen table. She'd been receiving files via email all day, building a comprehensive picture of Heartland Financial's activities across the state. "Jake, you need to see this," she called when he came in from the barn. The documents showed a clear pattern: In the 18 months since Heartland Financial had begun acquiring local banks, foreclosure rates on family farms had increased by 300%. But that wasn't the most damning part. Look at this. Pat pointed to a series of property transfers. Every single foreclosed farm was sold within 30 days to one of 3 corporations, and all 3 have ties to Midwest AgriCorp. They're using the banks to force us out, then swooping in to buy cheap, Jake said, the full scope of the scheme becoming clear. It's worse than that. These corporations received federal agricultural subsidies meant for family farms. They're using taxpayer money to destroy the very communities those programs were designed to protect. Jake sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the systematic nature of the betrayal. How is this legal? It's not, but it requires someone to connect the dots, to prove intent rather than coincidence. Your case with the documented violations of banking law could be the key to unraveling the whole thing. Emma wandered into the kitchen, drawn by the serious tone of their conversation. "What's wrong, Dad?" Jake struggled to explain complicated financial concepts to a 10-year-old. "Remember how we talked about the bank wanting to take our farm? Well, Miss, Pat is helping us prove they weren't playing fair. Like cheating at a game?" "Exactly like that," Pat confirmed. "And when someone cheats, there should be consequences." That evening, as they shared another simple meal, the conversation turned to broader topics. Pat told stories from her childhood on a Minnesota farm, while Emma peppered her with questions about being a senator. Jake found himself relaxing, enjoying the company and conversation in a way he hadn't since Amy's death. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked Pat. "The farming life?" "Every day," she admitted. "There's something authentic about it that's missing. From politics, the land doesn't lie to you, doesn't make false promises. Your work produces tangible results, food that feeds people, soil that's improved for the next generation. But your work matters too," Jake pointed out. "Without people like you fighting for us in government, family farms would already be extinct." "Sometimes I wonder if I'm just delaying the inevitable," Pat said quietly. "The economic forces arrayed against small operations are overwhelming. Corporate efficiency, economies of scale. On paper, it all makes sense." "Paper doesn't know about late nights in the carving barn," Jake countered. "Doesn't understand the value of knowing every acre of your land intimately, or teaching your daughter which fields flood in heavy rain and which stay dry. That knowledge can't be replicated by corporate farm managers working from spreadsheets." Emma, who had been listening intently, piped up. "Ms. Pat, if you save our farm, will you come visit? I could show you my butterfly meadow in the summer." Pat's eyes glistened. "I would love that, sweetheart. It's a date." As darkness fell, they moved to the living room. The power held steady, but Jake built up the fire anyway, the dancing flames creating a cozy atmosphere. Pat had brought some of her files from the kitchen and was reviewing them by lamplight while Emma worked on a jigsaw puzzle. "Jake," Pat said suddenly, "I need to ask you something. If we manage to stop this foreclosure, what then?" The underlying financial pressures haven't changed. The drought still happened, crop prices are still volatile. It was a fair question, one Jake had been avoiding. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've been so focused on the immediate crisis, I haven't thought much beyond Monday. Maybe I need to diversify, find additional income streams. Some farmers are having success with agritourism or specialized crops for local markets." "There are programs," Pat mused. "Grants for sustainable agriculture, assistance for farms transitioning to organic. I could help you navigate those, assuming we get past Monday." "We will." Pat's confidence was reassuring. "I've seen enough to know this foreclosure is legally questionable at best, criminally fraudulent at worst. The question is what comes after." They talked late into the evening, brainstorming possibilities for the farm's future. Pat's knowledge of agricultural programs and legislation complemented Jake's practical farming experience. Ideas flowed: a small organic vegetable operation for local restaurants, agritourism featuring Emma's butterfly meadow, possibly even educational programs for urban schools. "You could be a model," Pat suggested. "Show how family farms can adapt and thrive without selling out to corporate interests." "That's a lot of pressure," Jake said, though he was intrigued by the possibilities. "All meaningful change starts with someone willing to be first," Pat replied. "Your great-grandfather was first to break this soil. Maybe you're meant to be first in showing a new way forward." Around 10 o'clock, Emma finally succumbed to exhaustion. Jake carried her upstairs, Pat following with the quilt from the couch. As he tucked his daughter in, Pat stood in the doorway, observing the nightly ritual. "She's lucky to have you," Pat said softly as they returned downstairs. "I'm the lucky one. She's been my anchor through everything. Amy's illness, the financial struggles. Some days she's the only reason I keep fighting." They settled back. By the fire, a comfortable silence between them. The house creaked and settled around them, sounds Jake had known all his life. He wondered if he'd hear them much longer. "Can I tell you something?" Pat said eventually. "Something I haven't shared with many people?" Jake nodded. "When my father lost our farm, he never recovered. Spent his final years bitter and broken, convinced he'd failed us. I watched it destroy him from the inside. That's really why I went into politics, not just to help other farmers, but to somehow redeem his memory, to prove his life had meaning, beyond that loss. I'm sure he'd be proud of what you've accomplished. I hope so, but sometimes I wonder if I've spent so much time fighting for an ideal that I've lost touch with the reality. This weekend, being here, doing chores, seeing how you and Emma live, it's reminded me what I'm actually fighting for." Jake poked at the fire, sending sparks spiraling up the chimney. "It's easy to feel disconnected from the bigger picture when you're just trying to survive day to day. Having you here, learning about the systematic nature of what's happening, it's helped me see our struggle as part of something larger." "We need each other," Pat observed. "Farmers need advocates who understand the policy side, and politicians need connection to the people affected by their decisions." "Sounds like the beginning of a beautiful friendship," Jake said with a slight smile, quoting the old movie they'd watched with Emma earlier. Pat laughed. "I think this is the beginning of something important, yes. Win or lose Monday, this experience has changed my perspective. The fight isn't just about preserving family farms as museum pieces. It's about finding new models that honor tradition while embracing necessary change." As midnight approached, they finally headed to their respective rooms. But Jake found sleep elusive, his mind racing with possibilities. For the first time in months, he was thinking beyond mere survival. Pat's presence had brought not just legal help, but a broader vision of what might be possible. Outside, the snow gleamed under starlight, the storm's violence transformed into serene beauty. The weather had been an adversary, but it had also been a gift, stranding Pat here long enough for connections to form, for understanding to develop. In the guest room, Pat sat by the window, looking out at the snow-covered fields. She thought about her father, about the farm they'd lost, about the winding path that had led her to this moment. Tomorrow's fight with the bank was just one battle in a larger war, but it felt pivotal. She pulled out her phone and began drafting notes for legislation she'd introduce next session. A comprehensive Farm Protection Act that would close the loopholes Heartland Financial was exploiting. Jake's situation would be the case study, the human face that made abstract policy real. But beyond the political calculations, she found herself genuinely caring about this family's fate. Jake's quiet strength, Emma's innocent enthusiasm, the way they'd welcomed a stranger without hesitation, these were the values that needed protecting, the spirit that corporate agriculture could never replicate. As the old farmhouse settled into deep night quiet, 3 people under its roof contemplated futures suddenly expanded with possibility. The storm had passed, leaving behind not just tons of snow, but the seeds of change, connections that would ripple far beyond one family's fight to save their land. Monday would bring confrontation with the bank, legal maneuvers, the harsh reality of financial distress. But it would also bring the power of truth finally spoken, of systematic injustice exposed, of ordinary people refusing to be crushed by forces that seemed overwhelming. The Miller farm had weathered blizzards before, had survived droughts and depressions, wars, and personal tragedies. Now it faced perhaps its greatest challenge, but for the first time in months, its owner didn't face that challenge alone. Sunday morning brought brilliant sunshine that transformed the snow-covered landscape into a glittering wonderland. Jake woke early, as always, but this time with a sense of anticipation rather than dread. Tomorrow's confrontation with the bank loomed, but he no longer faced it alone. Downstairs, he found Pat already awake, hunched over her laptop at the kitchen table. Documents surrounded her in organized piles, and she was typing furiously. "Morning," Jake said, starting the coffee. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep, too much to prepare." She looked up, and he noticed the determined set of her jaw. "I've been coordinating with the Attorney General's office. They're filing the emergency injunction at 9 tomorrow morning, the moment the courthouse opens." "What are our chances, really?" Pat leaned back, considering. "The legal violations are clear, but Heartland Financial has deep pockets and political connections. They'll fight hard." Emma appeared in the doorway, still in her pajamas. "Are we going to church today, Dad?" Jake hesitated. The roads were barely passable, and he had so much to prepare for tomorrow. But routine mattered, especially now. "If we can make it to town, yes." "Can Ms. Pat come?" Pat smiled at the invitation. "I'd like that if you don't mind the company." An hour later, they piled into Jake's truck, which he'd equipped with chains for better traction. The journey that normally took 15 minutes stretched to nearly 40 as they navigated around massive drifts and crawled through sections where the plows had only cleared a single lane. Millbrook Community Church sat on Main Street, its white steeple a landmark visible for miles. As they pulled into the freshly plowed parking lot, Jake noticed more cars than usual. Apparently, surviving the blizzard had inspired communal gratitude. Inside, heads turned as they entered. Jake rarely brought guests, and Pat's unfamiliar face drew curious glances. They found seats near the back just as Pastor Williams began the service. "Friends, we've weathered quite a storm," the pastor began. "But as always, our community has pulled together. I've heard stories of neighbors helping neighbors, of strangers offering shelter, of grace shown in difficult circumstances." Jake felt Pat shift beside him and wondered if she was thinking about their own strange encounter. The service continued with readings about providence and unexpected blessings, themes that felt particularly relevant. During the prayer requests, Tom Anderson stood. Jake recognized him as one of the farmers who'd lost his land to Heartland Financial 6 months earlier. "I want to pray for the Miller family," Tom said, his voice thick with emotion. "They're facing what many of us have faced. But I've heard there might be hope for them, that someone's finally standing up to these banks. If they can save their farm, maybe there's hope for justice for all of us." Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks as sympathetic eyes turned toward him. He hadn't realized word had spread about Pat's involvement. She reached over and squeezed his hand reassuringly. After the service, they were surrounded by neighbors. Jake introduced Pat simply as a friend who'd been stranded during the storm, but he could see speculation in people's eyes. In a small town, secrets didn't last long. "Is it true?" Martha Petrosky asked quietly. Her husband had lost their dairy farm last spring. "Is someone really investigating the bank?" Pat stepped forward. "Yes. I'm State Senator Patricia Richardson." I've been documenting illegal foreclosure practices for months. Jake's case might be the key to exposing everything. The crowd pressed closer, hope flickering in faces that had grown resigned to loss. Pat found herself answering questions, explaining legal processes, promising to fight for all of them. Jake watched as she transformed from weekend houseguest to political advocate, her passion genuine and infectious. "We've felt so helpless," Bob Chen said. His vegetable farm was struggling to make payments, like we were fighting something too big to beat. "You're not alone anymore," Pat assured him. "What's happening here is happening across the state. But together, we can stop it." As they finally made their way back to the truck, Emma tugged on Pat's sleeve. "You're kind of famous, aren't you?" Pat laughed. "Only in certain circles. But what matters isn't fame. It's using whatever influence you have to help people." The drive home was quiet, each lost in thought about tomorrow's looming confrontation. Back at the farm, they spent the afternoon in final preparations. Pat coached Jake on what to expect, how to respond to likely bank tactics. "Brennan will probably come with papers for you to sign," she explained. "Something that seems like a reasonable offer, but actually waives your rights. Don't sign anything without legal review." "What if he brings the sheriff, forces us out?" "The emergency injunction should be filed by then. If he tries anything before that, I'll be on the phone to the Attorney General immediately. They're prepared to intervene." As evening approached, Jake found himself pacing restlessly. The waiting was almost worse than the crisis itself. Pat suggested they go for a walk to clear their heads. They bundled up and ventured out into the snow-covered fields. The setting sun painted the landscape in shades of orange and pink, the beauty almost painful in its perfection. Emma ran ahead, throwing snowballs for their old farm dog, Max. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Pat said quietly, "I want you to know how much this weekend has meant to me. You've reminded me why I do this work." "You've given us hope," Jake replied. "That's worth more than you know." They walked in companionable silence until they reached the property line. In the distance, they could see the lights of the neighboring farm, now owned by Midwest AgriCorp. The contrast was stark. Automated systems, industrial buildings, no sign of human presence. "That's the future they want," Jake observed. "Farms without farmers." "Not if I have anything to say about it," Pat said firmly. "And after this weekend, I have quite a lot to say." That evening, they shared what might be their last meal together in the farmhouse. Jake had prepared his mother's pot roast recipe, filling the kitchen with comforting aromas. Emma chatted about school starting again on Tuesday, seemingly unaware of the magnitude of tomorrow's events. After dinner, as Jake tucked Emma in, she asked the question he'd been dreading. "Dad, if we have to leave the farm, where will we go?" He sat on the edge of her bed, choosing his words carefully. "We'll figure something out, sweetheart. Maybe an apartment in town for a while." "But what about the animals? What about Mom's garden?" Jake's throat tightened. Amy had planted a memorial garden near the house, perennials that returned each spring. The thought of leaving it behind was almost unbearable. "Let's focus on tomorrow first, okay? Miss Pat is going to help us try to keep the farm." "She's nice," Emma said sleepily. "I hope she visits again, even if we don't live here anymore." Downstairs, Jake found Pat on the phone with her chief of staff, finalizing details for tomorrow. When she finished, she joined him by the fireplace. "She's worried about her mother's garden," Jake said quietly. Pat nodded understanding. "It's never just about the land, is it? It's about all the memories rooted in that soil." They sat in silence, watching the flames dance. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily toward midnight, toward Monday's reckoning. "I've been thinking," Pat finally said, "whatever happens tomorrow, this can't be the end. Your story needs to be told widely. Would you be willing to testify before the state legislature? Share your experience publicly?" Jake considered this. He'd always been private, uncomfortable with attention. But if his story could help other farmers, if it would make a difference, yes, it would. People need to see the human cost of these corporate tactics. Emma's worry about her mother's garden, that's what legislators need to hear. As midnight approached, they reluctantly headed to bed. Tomorrow would demand everything they had. Jake lay awake, his mind cycling through scenarios. Best case, the injunction stopped the foreclosure and bought time to expose the broader conspiracy. Worst case, by tomorrow night he and Emma would be packing their belongings, preparing to leave the only home she'd known. Monday dawned cold and crystal clear. Jake was in the barn before sunrise, doing chores that might be his last on this land. He fed the cattle, collected eggs, and checked on the equipment. Each familiar task waited with potential finality. Pat appeared as he was finishing, dressed in her business suit, now cleaned and pressed. The transformation from weekend farmhand to state senator was complete. "Ready?" she asked. "As I'll ever be." They returned to the house to find Emma already dressed for school. "I want to stay home today," she announced. "I want to be here when the bank man comes." Jake started to object, but Pat intervened. "She has a right to be here. This is her home too." At exactly 9 o'clock, Pat's phone rang. The Attorney General's office confirming the injunction had been filed. A judge would review it within the hour. "Now we wait," she said. At 9:45, a black sedan pulled into the driveway. Jake recognized Mike Brennan's car, followed by an unfamiliar SUV. His hands tightened into fists as he watched Brennan emerge, accompanied by a man in an expensive suit, and Jake's heart sank. "Sheriff Watson?" "They brought law enforcement," he said grimly. "Expected," Pat replied calmly. "Remember, don't sign anything. Let me do most of the talking." They met the delegation on the front porch. Brennan's face registered surprise at seeing Pat, then hardened into professional neutrality. "Mr. Miller," he began formally, "I'm here regarding the foreclosure proceedings on this property. This is Derek Coleman from Heartland Financial's legal department, and Sheriff Watson is here to ensure an orderly transition." "Mr. Brennan," Pat stepped forward, "I'm State Senator Patricia Richardson. I'm here as a witness to these proceedings, and to inform you that an emergency injunction has been filed to halt this foreclosure pending investigation of illegal banking practices." Coleman's eyes narrowed. "On what grounds?" "Violation of federal lending regulations, failure to provide required notices, and systematic denial of loan modification options mandated by law." Pat's tone was crisp, professional. "The Attorney General's office is prepared to file criminal charges if this foreclosure proceeds." Brennan shifted uncomfortably. "We've followed all proper procedures." "Have you?" Pat pulled out her phone. "I have documentation of 17 similar foreclosures by your bank, all exhibiting the same pattern of violations. All properties subsequently sold to corporations with ties to Midwest Agricorp. That suggests conspiracy to defraud." Coleman whispered urgently to Brennan, then addressed Pat. "Senator, I'm sure we can discuss this reasonably. Perhaps there's been some misunderstanding." He was interrupted by Pat's phone ringing. She answered, listened briefly, then smiled. "That was the Attorney General's office. The emergency injunction has been granted. This foreclosure is officially halted pending full investigation." The silence stretched taut. Emma, who had been watching from the doorway, ran to Jake and hugged his waist. He put a protective arm around her. "Furthermore," Pat continued, "federal investigators will be arriving this afternoon to review Heartland Financial's records. I suggest you preserve all documents related to farm foreclosures over the past 18 months. Coleman's face had gone pale. "This is highly irregular. We'll be filing an appeal." "That's your right, but I should mention that 3 of your bank's board members received subpoenas this morning. The investigation extends beyond procedural violations to potential racketeering charges." Sheriff Watson, who had remained silent throughout, cleared his throat. "Sounds like this is a legal matter for the courts now. I see no reason for enforcement action today." Brennan looked like he wanted to argue, but Coleman grabbed his arm. "We need to contact headquarters immediately," he muttered. They retreated to their vehicles, Coleman already on his phone. As the cars disappeared down the driveway, Jake felt his knees go weak with relief. Pat steadied him with a hand on his shoulder. "Is it over?" Emma asked in a small voice. "The immediate crisis, yes," Pat replied. "But this is just the beginning of a bigger fight." They returned inside, Jake still processing the sudden reversal. The farm was safe, at least temporarily, but Pat was already on her phone, coordinating. "Next steps. The media will pick this up quickly," she told him between calls. "Are you prepared for attention? Reporters will want your story." Jake looked around the kitchen, at the table where 4 generations of Millers had shared meals, at the window overlooking fields his great-grandfather had first plowed. If telling our story helps other families keep their farms, then yes. By afternoon, the first news vans appeared. Pat coached Jake through interviews, helping him articulate not just his personal struggle, but the broader implications of predatory banking practices. "This isn't just about one farm," he found himself saying to a reporter. "It's about preserving a way of life, about communities having the right to exist, independent of corporate control." The story exploded across regional media. By evening, national outlets were calling. The human interest angle, single father saved from foreclosure by the very senator he'd rescued from a blizzard, captured public imagination. But beyond the feel-good narrative, serious investigations began. Federal agents descended on Heartland Financial's offices. Other farmers came forward with similar stories. The pattern of systematic targeting became undeniable. 3 days later, Pat stood before the state legislature, introducing emergency legislation to protect family farms from predatory lending practices. Jake and Emma sat in the gallery, watching as she used their story to illuminate the need for change. "Jake Miller represents the best of what we should protect," she declared. "Generational wisdom, sustainable practices, commitment to community." When he saw a stranger in need during a blizzard, he didn't calculate personal benefit, he simply helped. That's the spirit that built this country, and it's worth preserving. The legislation passed overwhelmingly. Within months, federal investigations led to indictments of Heartland financial executives. The systematic scheme to force foreclosures and transfer land to corporate agriculture was exposed and dismantled. Jake's farm became a symbol of successful resistance. With the immediate threat removed and new protections in place, he was able to restructure his loans fairly. The ideas he and Pat had brainstormed during the blizzard weekend began to take shape. Sustainable agriculture initiatives, educational programs, a small agritourism operation featuring Emma's butterfly meadow. A year later, on a warm summer evening, Pat returned to the farm for Emma's 11th birthday party. The memorial garden Amy had planted bloomed in full glory, and the butterfly meadow attracted visitors from across the state. "You saved more than just our farm," Jake told Pat as they watched Emma lead a group of children through the butterfly garden. "You saved a way of life for dozens of families." "We saved each other," Pat corrected. "You reminded me why I entered. Public service. Your story gave my work meaning and urgency it had lost." As the sun set over the thriving farm, 3 people who had been brought together by a blizzard contemplated how unexpected connections could change the course of lives. The storm had been fierce, but what grew from it, friendship, justice, renewed hope, would endure far longer than any weather. The Miller farm stood strong, its future secured not by corporate efficiency, but by human decency, community support, and the simple act of helping a stranger in need. In the end, that made all the difference. 3 years had passed since that. Fateful blizzard weekend. The Miller farm had transformed from a struggling operation on the brink of foreclosure to a model of sustainable agriculture and rural innovation. Jake stood in the same kitchen where he'd once stared at foreclosure notices, now reviewing plans for the farm's newest venture, an educational center that would teach sustainable farming practices to the next generation. The morning sun streamed through windows that had been upgraded with energy-efficient glass, part of the improvements made possible by grants Pat had helped secure. The old farmhouse retained its character, but now boasted modern amenities that made it both comfortable and environmentally responsible. Emma, now 14 and growing tall like her mother, bounded into the kitchen with her characteristic energy. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore work boots with the ease of someone who'd grown up understanding that farm life meant being ready for anything. "Dad, the school group from Minneapolis arrives at 10, she reminded him, grabbing an apple from the bowl on the counter. "I've got the butterfly house prepped, and Mrs. Torres said she'd help with the sustainable garden tour." Linda Torres had become more than a neighbor. She was now the farm's education coordinator, helping manage the growing agritourism and educational programs that had become a significant income stream. "And Pat called," Emma added with a knowing smile. "Said she's bringing someone special to the anniversary celebration tonight." Tonight marked 3 years since the emergency injunction that had saved their farm. What had started as a small family dinner had grown into an annual community event, celebrating not just their victory, but the broader movement for agricultural justice that had followed. Jake's phone buzzed with a text from Pat. "Landing at 2 p.m. Can't wait to see what you've built. Bringing a surprise guest who wants to meet the famous Jake Miller." The famous part still made him uncomfortable. The media attention following their story had been overwhelming at first. Jake had found himself testifying before Congress, his simple farmer's perspective helping shape national agricultural policy. But he'd always preferred the quiet work of actual farming to the spotlight of activism. As morning chores gave way to preparation for the school visit, Jake reflected on how dramatically life had changed. The farm now employed 6 people full-time, including 2 young farmers who were learning the operation as part of a succession planning program Pat had helped create. The initiative addressed one of rural America's biggest challenges, helping new farmers access land and knowledge without crushing debt. The school bus arrived precisely at 10, disgorging 30 excited 7th graders from an inner-city Minneapolis school. Jake watched Emma take charge, her confidence in leading the tour evident. She'd grown into her role as the farm's youth ambassador, connecting with visiting students in ways that surprised and delighted their teachers. "Welcome to Miller Heritage Farm," Emma began, her voice clear and enthusiastic. 3 years ago, this place almost became another corporate field. Today, it's proof that family farms can thrive when communities support them and farmers adapt to changing times. Jake smiled at her polished introduction. She'd given dozens of these tours now, each time refining her message. But the passion remained genuine. This land was in her blood as surely as it was in his. As the students explored, the butterfly house, now expanded to include native pollinators crucial to agricultural health, Jake's phone rang. It was Tom Anderson, the farmer who'd lost his land years ago, but had recently started a new operation with help from the restitution fund established after Heartland Financial's executives were convicted. "Jake, you'll never believe what just happened." Tom's voice crackled with excitement. "That impact investment group Pat connected me with, they've approved funding for the cooperative processing facility. We can break ground next month." The processing facility was part of a larger vision that had emerged from their struggle, creating infrastructure that allowed small farms to access markets previously dominated by corporate agriculture. By processing and packaging products locally, Farmers could capture more value from their crops while providing fresher products to consumers. That's fantastic, Tom. This changes everything for the co-op members. None of this would have happened without you and Pat starting the fight, Tom said, emotion thick in his voice. My grandkids will be able to farm because of what you did. After the call, Jake made his rounds, checking on various operations. The farm had diversified significantly. Beyond traditional crops, they now raised heritage breed chickens, maintained a market garden that supplied local restaurants, and operated a small creamery using milk from their grass-fed cows. Each enterprise contributed to both financial stability and ecological health. In the equipment barn, Bill Henderson, still the farm's mechanic, but now also a partner in the operation, was training a young apprentice on tractor maintenance. The memory of that sabotage drive shaft 3 years ago seemed like something from another lifetime. "Afternoon, boss," Bill called out with a grin. He'd taken to calling Jake boss as a joke after Jake had made him an equity partner in recognition of his years of loyalty. "Pat's speaking event still on for tonight?" "Far as I know, she's bringing someone special, apparently. Probably another politician wanting photo ops with the famous farm that stood up to big banks," Bill suggested with good-natured cynicism. But Pat had never used their story for mere political gain. Every public appearance, every legislative push had been genuinely focused on systemic change. The Agricultural Security and Family Farm Protection Act she'd championed, known informally as Jake's Law, had passed with bipartisan support and was already showing results in reduced foreclosure rates and increased lending transparency. By mid-afternoon, Jake was in the farm's new meeting space, a renovated barn that served as classroom, event venue, and community gathering place. He was reviewing applications for next season's farmer mentorship program when Emma burst in. "Dad, Pat's here and you'll never guess who she brought." Before Jake could respond, Pat entered, looking as energetic as ever despite her grueling schedule. Her silver hair was shorter now, a practical style that had become something of a trademark. Behind her walked someone Jake recognized from newspaper photos, but had never met in person. Michael Torres, the Secretary of Agriculture. "Jake Miller," Secretary Torres said, extending his hand with genuine warmth. "I've wanted to meet you for a long time. Your story, and more importantly, what you've built since, represents everything we're trying to achieve in agricultural policy." Jake shook hands, momentarily stunned. "Mr. Secretary, this is unexpected. Please, call me Michael. Pat's been telling me about tonight's anniversary celebration. I hope you don't mind an extra guest." "Of course not. Though I should warn you, it's become more of a community potluck than a formal event." Secretary Torres laughed. "Perfect. I grew up on a farm in New Mexico. Potlucks were how we celebrated everything." Pat beamed at the interaction. "Michael's here because we're announcing something tomorrow. But tonight is about celebrating what this community has accomplished." As evening approached, cars began filling the expanded parking area. What had started as a small gathering had evolved into the agricultural event of the year for the region. Farmers, local officials, agricultural researchers, and community members mingled freely, sharing food and conversation. Jake found himself standing with Pat and Secretary Torres near the memorial garden Amy had planted. The perennials bloomed in profusion, a living reminder of love that endured beyond loss. "You've created something remarkable here," Torres observed. "Not just a successful farm, but a template for agricultural resilience." "It wasn't just me," Jake protested. "Pat, the community, everyone who fought back against the foreclosures." "But you were the catalyst," Pat interrupted gently. "Your simple act of helping a stranger in a storm set everything in motion. Never underestimate the power of individual action to spark systemic change." Emma appeared with a group of young farmers from the mentorship program. "Dad, they're ready for the presentations." The evening's program began with Jake reluctantly taking the microphone. Public speaking still wasn't his comfort zone, but he'd learned to push through the discomfort when the message mattered. 3 years ago, I thought I was about to lose everything, he began, looking out at the familiar faces in the crowd. What I learned is that everything isn't just land or buildings. It's community, connections, shared values. When we stand together, we're stronger than any corporation or corrupt system. Lucidity, he introduced the young farmers in the mentorship program, each sharing their story of entering agriculture despite the economic challenges. Their enthusiasm was infectious, their innovations impressive. One had developed a smartphone app, helping small farms coordinate crop planning to avoid market gluts. Another was pioneering regenerative grazing techniques that actually sequestered carbon while improving soil health. Pat spoke next, her political skills evident in how she wove individual stories into broader policy narratives. But there was also genuine emotion as she recalled that blizzard weekend. "I came to Jake's farm as a stranger in distress," she said. "I left as a friend with renewed purpose. This place reminded me that politics isn't about power, it's about people. Every vote I cast, every bill I write, I think about families like the Millers and communities like this one." Secretary Torres surprised everyone by sharing his own family story of nearly losing their farm in the 1980s. Places like this, where traditional wisdom meets innovation, where profit coexists with stewardship, represent the future of American agriculture. Tomorrow, I'll be announcing a national initiative based on the model you've created here. As the formal program ended and the celebration continued with music from a local bluegrass band, Jake found quiet moments to connect with neighbors and friends. The Petersons were expanding their organic operation. The Chens had secured a contract with a regional grocery chain for their specialty vegetables. Martha Petrosky's niece was returning from college to take over the family's dairy operation, armed with new ideas about artisanal cheese production. Each success story traced back somehow to that weekend 3 years ago when desperation had led to action, when a stranger's arrival had catalyzed change that rippled far beyond one farm. Later, as the crowd thinned and the cleanup began, Jake sat with Pat and Secretary Torres on the farmhouse porch. Emma had gone to help store leftover food with Linda Torres, leaving the adults to a quieter conversation. "The initiative I'm announcing tomorrow," Torres began, "is a national network of demonstration farms like yours. Places where new farmers can learn, where sustainable practices are tested and refined, where the economic viability of family-scale agriculture is proven daily." "And the funding?" Pat asked with characteristic directness. "Secured through the Infrastructure and Agriculture Resilience Act, 50 demonstration farms in the first phase, with plans to expand to 200 within 5 years. Jake, we'd like Miller Heritage Farm to be one of the flagship sites." Jake leaned back in, his chair processing the request. What would that mean exactly? Federal support for your educational programs, research partnerships with universities, and resources to expand your mentorship initiatives. But more importantly, it means your model, this blend of tradition and innovation, becomes a template for national agricultural policy. The best part, Pat added, is that it's not about imposing solutions from Washington. It's about amplifying what's already working, sharing successful models across regions. Jake thought about his great-grandfather breaking virgin prairie with an ox-drawn plow. What would he think of laser-guided tractors and smartphone apps for crop planning? But then he realized the old man would probably approve. He'd been an innovator too in his time. "I'll need to discuss it with Emma and our partners," Jake said finally. "But yes, I'm interested." As the evening wound down, Jake walked Pat and Secretary Torres to their car. The security detail that followed cabinet members tried to remain discreet. but their presence was a reminder of how far their local fight had reached. "You know," Pat said as they reached her rental car, "I never thanked you properly for saving my life that night." Jake smiled. "I think you've thanked me. Plenty. My farm is thriving. Dozens of families kept their land, and there's real hope for independent agriculture's future. That's thanks enough. Still, if you hadn't stopped, But I did stop. Just like you stopped everything to help us when you could have just gone on to your meeting. That's what community means. We show up for each other." Secretary Torres shook Jake's hand again. "I'll have my team contact you next week about the demonstration farm network. And Jake, thank you for reminding us why this work matters." Now, as their car disappeared down the drive, Jake stood in the darkness, listening to the night sounds of the farm. Cattle lowing in the barn, wind rustling through the corn that would soon be ready for harvest, the distant call of an owl from the woodlot his grandfather had preserved. Emma appeared beside him, linking her arm through his. "Good party, Dad. Even better than last year. You did great with those students today. You're becoming quite the educator." "I learned from the best," she said, squeezing his arm. "Mom always said teaching was just sharing what you love with others." They stood in comfortable silence, looking up at stars unpolluted by city lights. The same stars Jake's ancestors had navigated by, the same constellations that would guide future generations. "Dad, are we going to be part of that national program?" Secretary Torres mentioned. "What do you think we should do?" Emma considered, mature beyond her years. "I think we have to. Not for us. We're doing fine now. But for all the kids who visit here, who've never seen where their food comes from, for the young farmers who need to believe there's a future in this work, for the families still fighting to keep their land." Jake hugged his daughter, marveling at her wisdom. "When did you get so smart?" "Probably when I watched my dad stand up to a bank, help a senator, and save our whole community," she replied with a grin. "You set a pretty high bar for doing the right thing." The next morning, Jake was in the barn early, despite the late night. Farm life didn't pause for celebrations or cabinet secretaries. As he fed the cattle, he thought about the announcement Torres would make today, the ripple effects that might flow from their small farm's example. His phone buzzed with a text from Pat. "Heading to Des Moines for the announcement. Couldn't have done any of this without you. Next time I'm in a blizzard, I know who to call." Jake smiled, typing back, "Next time, maybe check the weather forecast first. Safe travels, friend." By mid-morning, the farm was humming with normal activity. The butterfly house welcomed a steady stream of visitors. The market, garden crew harvested vegetables for restaurant deliveries. The creamery processed milk from the morning's milking. What had once been a struggling single-operation farm now supported multiple enterprises and families. Linda Torres found Jake in the greenhouse, checking on seedlings for fall planting. "The secretary's announcement is streaming live in 15 minutes. Thought you might want to watch." They gathered in the meeting barn with several staff members and a few neighbors who'd stopped by. On the large screen, Pat had insisted they install for educational programs. Secretary Torres stood at a podium in Des Moines, flanked by agricultural officials and farm organization leaders. "Today, we launch the National Agricultural Resilience and Education Network," Torres began. "This initiative recognizes that the future of American agriculture lies not in choosing between tradition and innovation, but in combining the best of both." He outlined the program, referencing Miller Heritage Farm repeatedly as an example of successful integration of sustainable practices, economic viability, and educational outreach. The camera occasionally cut to Pat, seated with other dignitaries, her expression proud. "This network will prove that family-scale farming isn't a relic of the past, but a vital component of our agricultural future," Torres continued. "It will demonstrate that environmental stewardship and profitability aren't mutually exclusive. and that the knowledge held by multi-generational farming families is a national treasure worth preserving and sharing. As Jake watched, his phone vibrated with messages from farmers across the country. Many were people he'd met during the policy advocacy work following their foreclosure fight. The excitement was palpable. Finally, federal policy that supported rather than undermined their efforts. Emma appeared in the doorway, having finished guiding another school group. "Dad, there's a news crew outside. They want your reaction to the announcement." Jake sighed. The media attention was something he'd never gotten comfortable with, but he understood its importance. The story of one farm's survival had become something larger, a symbol of rural resilience, a proof point that different agricultural futures were possible. "Tell them 5 minutes," he said. "I should probably comb my hair first." As the day progressed, the significance of Torres's announcement became clearer. The demonstration farm network would channel substantial resources into family operations like theirs, but more importantly, it represented a philosophical shift in agricultural policy. Instead of pushing consolidation and industrialization, the government was formally recognizing the value of diverse, smaller-scale operations. That evening, Jake stood in Amy's memorial garden, as he often did when processing big decisions or changes. The perennials she'd planted were in their 3rd season now, established and thriving. He thought about how she would have reacted to all this: the fame, the responsibility, the opportunity to influence national policy. She would have been so proud, Linda Torres said, approaching quietly. She'd become close to Amy during her illness and understood Jake's need for these moments of reflection. "She always said the farm was meant for more than just our family," Jake replied, "that we were stewards of something bigger. I just never imagined it would become this big." "You saved more than a farm, Jake. You helped save a way of life. That's worth celebrating." As the sun set over the farm, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Jake thought about the journey from that desperate night reviewing foreclosure papers to this moment of national recognition and influence. The path had been improbable, marked by chance encounters and unexpected alliances, but perhaps that was the real lesson. Change didn't always come from grand plans or powerful institutions. Sometimes it started with simple human kindness, stopping to help a stranger in a storm, opening your home without question, standing up for what was right, even when the odds seemed impossible. The Miller farm would join the national network. They would continue to innovate while honoring tradition, to teach while learning, to prove daily that family agriculture had a vital future. And somewhere in the years ahead, another desperate farmer might find hope in their example, might discover that what seems like an ending can become a beginning. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Jake headed back to the house. Emma was doing homework at the kitchen table, the same scarred oak surface where 3 years ago he'd spread out foreclosure notices in despair. Now it held textbooks and plans for next season's planting, evidence of a future secured and bright with possibility. "Hey, Dad." Emma looked up with a smile. "Pat called. She said to tell you the announcement went perfectly and she'll see us next month for the harvest festival. Oh, and she said to check the weather forecast before then." Jake laughed, the sound rich with contentment and hope. "I'll be sure to do that." Outside, the farm settled into evening rhythms. In the barn, cattle munched hay grown in their own fields. In the creamery, tomorrow's cheese aged slowly. In the greenhouse, seedlings reached toward grow lights, preparing for transplant into soil that had been enriched by 4 generations of careful stewardship and would be tended by generations yet to come. The Miller farm stood as testament to the power of community, the importance of standing up to injustice, and the profound impact one act of kindness could have. 3 years after a blizzard brought desperate times and an unexpected friendship, hope had taken root as surely as the crops in the fields, growing stronger with each season, promising harvests not just of grain and vegetables, but of possibility itself. 5 years had passed since the blizzard that changed everything. The November wind carried the first hints of winter as Jake Miller stood in the entrance of the new Agricultural Innovation Center, watching the steady stream of visitors arriving for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. The building, constructed with sustainable materials and powered by solar panels and wind turbines, represented everything the farm had become. A perfect blend of traditional values and forward-thinking innovation. Emma, now 16 and poised with the confidence of someone who'd grown up in the public eye, stood beside him, adjusting the collar of his jacket. "Dad, you've got to stop fidgeting. You've given hundreds of speeches by now." Jake smiled at his daughter's mothering. "This one feels different. It's like we're closing a circle somehow." Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see the crowd gathering outside. Local farmers mingled with university researchers, government officials chatted with sustainable agriculture activists, and reporters set up their cameras to capture what many were calling a watershed moment for American farming. Pat Richardson emerged from the building, her silver hair now completely white, but her energy undiminished. She'd retired from the Senate the previous year, but remained deeply involved in agricultural advocacy as the director of the newly established National Family Farm Alliance. "Ready for your close-up, Mr. Miller?" she teased, straightening his tie with the familiarity of old friendship. "You know I still hate the spotlight," Jake replied, though his smile betrayed his pride in what they'd built. "Too bad. You're stuck with it. Besides, someone needs to remind the world that heroes come in overalls as often as uniforms." As they prepared for the ceremony, Jake's mind wandered to all that had transpired since that fateful night. The demonstration farm network had exceeded all expectations, with over 300 farms now participating nationwide. The mentorship program had helped launch dozens of young farmers, many from non-agricultural backgrounds, proving that farming's future needn't be limited to those born into it. The legal aftermath of the Heartland financial case had been even more far-reaching than anticipated. The investigation had uncovered a web of corporate collusion extending into multiple states, resulting in the largest agricultural antitrust settlement in U.S. history. The restitution fund had helped over 1,000 family farms restructure their debt and remain operational. Secretary Torres approached, now in his final months before retirement. "Jake, I wanted to thank you one more time before the circus begins. When I took this position, I had theories about agricultural policy. You and farmers like you gave me the real-world understanding to turn those theories into effective programs." Before Jake could respond, Linda Torres appeared with her clipboard, ever the efficient coordinator, even as the farm's operations had expanded exponentially. 10 minutes, everyone. The governor's car just pulled up. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of speeches, handshakes, and camera flashes. Jake spoke about the journey from near foreclosure to national model, carefully crediting the community effort while downplaying his own role. Emma presented the center's mission statement, written in collaboration with young farmers from across the country. Pat delivered a stirring address about the future of American agriculture, weaving together themes of sustainability, technology, and tradition. As the ribbon was cut and the crowd toured the facility's state-of-the-art classrooms, laboratories, and meeting spaces, Jake found a moment of quiet in the center's library. The room housed both cutting-edge agricultural research and historical farming documents, including journals from his great-grandfather's homesteading days. Emma found him there, holding an old leather-bound diary. "Hiding from your admirers? Just thinking about great-great-grandpa Miller. Wonder what he'd make of all this." Emma sat beside him, reading over his shoulder. The faded handwriting described the challenges of breaking prairie soil, the uncertainty of weather, the faith required to plant seeds in untested ground. "I think he'd recognize more than you might expect," she said thoughtfully. "Different tools, same values. He was an innovator too, trying new crops, experimenting with techniques. The scale's different, but the spirit's the same." Through the window, they could see the farm spreading out before them. The original farmhouse still stood, now serving as a heritage museum showcasing 4 generations of agricultural evolution. The butterfly meadow had expanded into a pollinator research station. The fields demonstrated various sustainable practices: cover, cropping, rotational grazing, permaculture gardens, and precision agriculture existing side by side. "I've been accepted to Cornell," Emma said suddenly. "Agricultural science with a focus on climate adaptation." Jake turned to her, surprised. She'd been keeping her college plans close to the vest. "Cornell's an excellent choice, though I thought you might want to get farther from the farm." "The opposite, actually. Everything I've learned here, everything we've built, it needs to be replicated and adapted across the country. We're going to need every tool available to feed the world while healing the land. I want to be part of that solution." Pride swelled in Jake's chest, not just at her acceptance to such a prestigious program, but at the young woman she'd become, thoughtful, purposeful, committed to something larger than herself. "Your mother would be so proud," he said softly. "She is proud," Emma replied, with conviction. "I feel her here every day, in the garden she planted, in the values she taught us, in the way this place has become about nurturing growth, of plants, of people, of possibilities." As the afternoon wound down and the crowds began to disperse, Jake stood with Pat on the center's observation deck, looking out over the farm. The setting sun painted the landscape in golden hues, highlighting the wind turbines on the ridge, the greenhouses extending the growing season, the test plots where university students researched drought-resistant crops. "Any regrets?" Patty asked. Jake considered the question. The path from desperate farmer to national advocate hadn't been easy. The scrutiny, the pressure, the constant balancing of tradition and innovation had taken their toll. But against that stood the faces of farmers who'd kept their land, young people who'd found their calling, communities that had rediscovered their agricultural heritage. "No regrets," he said finally, "though I sometimes miss the simplicity of just being a farmer." Pat laughed. "You're still a farmer, Jake. You just farm hope now instead of only corn and soybeans." As if to emphasize the point, a group of young farmers from the mentorship program approached, eager to share their plans for a cooperative processing facility that would help small producers access larger markets. Jake listened to their enthusiasm, offered suggestions based on hard-won experience, and felt the familiar satisfaction of knowledge passed on, of cycles continuing. That evening, as the farm settled into its nighttime rhythms, Jake walked the paths he'd walked all his life. In the equipment shed, the old tractor that had brought him and Pat together still sat in its place of honor, maintained now as a teaching tool for restoration workshops. The faded foreclosure notice was framed on the wall of the Heritage Center, a reminder of how close they'd come to losing everything. He ended his walk at Amy's Memorial Garden, now expanded into a meditation space used by visiting students and researchers. The original perennials had been joined by native plants that attracted butterflies and bees, creating a living laboratory of ecological interactions. Emma joined him there, as she often did in the evening. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, the same stars that had guided his ancestors, that would guide future generations of farmers facing challenges yet unknown. "Dad," Emma said eventually, What do you think about that night? When Ms. Pat was stranded? Often, Jake admitted. Such a small decision, to go out in a storm to help a stranger. Hard to believe everything that followed. I don't think it was small at all, Emma reflected. I think it was exactly as big as it needed to be. Sometimes the most important moments look ordinary when they happen. As they headed back to the house, Jake considered his daughter's wisdom. She was right, of course. The extraordinary often wore the disguise of the everyday. A farmer checking on stranded motorists, a senator taking shelter with strangers, a community refusing to let a neighbor fail alone. The Miller Heritage Farm and agricultural innovation center stood as a monument to those ordinary moments that change everything. But more than buildings or programs, its true legacy lay in the lives touched, the connections forged, the proof that individual action could still matter in a world of vast systems and powerful interests. That night, as Jake reviewed the next day's schedule, a delegation from Japan studying their integrated farming systems, a webinar on climate-resilient crops, a planning meeting for the National Young Farmers Conference, he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The farm was secure. His daughter was launched on her own path of service, and the ripples from one snowy night continued to spread. He pulled out his phone and sent a text to Pat. "Thank you again for getting stranded in the right place at the right time." Her reply came quickly. "Thank you for stopping to help. Best decision I ever made was accepting that cup of hot chocolate." Outside, the first snowflakes of the season began to fall, dusting the fields with white. Somewhere out there, Jake knew, other farmers were struggling with mortgages, fighting weather, wondering if their way of life had a future. Tomorrow, some of them would find their way to the center, looking for answers, for hope, for proof that family farming could survive and thrive in the modern world. And they would find it here, in the story of a farm that almost died, a friendship forged in a blizzard, and the enduring truth that kindness, courage, and community could still change the world, one decision at a time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.